Hello and welcome back, or indeed welcome to ID24, Inclusive Design 24 2021. My name is Henny Swan and I'm based in Brighton, and so far we've had a range of talks following the sunrise from Australia through to India, Finland, and now the UK via Japan as well. ID24 is brought to you in partnership with our platinum supporters, Intopia, Fable, Arc, and Adobe, and our gold supporter, Tetralogical. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, which is ID to the number for the number CONF. And if you have questions for the presenters at the end, please do tweet us using the ID24 hashtag, and we will hopefully have time for some questions. I am really happy to be handing over to our guest hosts, which is Kevin Mar Molinaro, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Henny. Hi, I'm Kevin Mar Molinaro. I live in London, and I'm actually incredibly excited to be presenting Alastair Campbell, who's going to do a talk on what's next in WCAG 2.2, what's new and what to do with it. Alastair is director at Nemenska. I hope I've pronounced that properly, with a background in psychology and human-computer interaction, and is also co-chair of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. So it's been deeply involved in the development of these new guidelines. So I'm extremely excited to hand over to Alastair.
Thank you very much. So what I would like to cover today is a bit of an intro to the guidelines. It's not going to be, well, I am going to assume most people have come across the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines before, so it's mostly tackling misapprehensions that I've noticed people having. We'll then move on to what will probably be in WCAG 2.2. It's not completely finalised yet, but we'll cover what's there. And then the final section is what to do with it. Again, there are various ways that people can use these guidelines, so these will be my recommendations. Just to start off with, I do think about accessibility as essentially usability for people with disabilities, but there are big overlaps and ways we need to think about how the access technologies work. And particularly today, I'm very much focusing on the platform standards side of it, with a focus on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So where do these come from? And just a very brief history, they come from the World Wide Web Consortium, the consortium founded by Tim Berners-Lee. And right from the beginning, they were thought of as being, the web standards were thought as being for everyone. And W3C shepherds these web standards like HTML and CSS, and it's a membership organization. So you do have the big players like Google's, Microsoft's, Apple's, people who create browsers. But we have a good number of accessibility specialist organizations like Nemenska and some of the other organizations involved today, who are either working on these standards and particularly on the sort of accessibility side as well. So why did the W3C tackle accessibility originally? Well, I'm showing on screen, a picture from space. The idea being there were multiple countries thinking about accessibility and how to apply it to technology, the web, in terms of regulations. And what could have happened is that you could have had the European accessibility guidelines and competing US guidelines, and other countries might have got involved. So there could have been a kind of huge fragmentation of how accessibility on the web worked. So I think that was one of the motivations for the W3C to tackle this, wanting one set of guidelines that sort of worked for everyone. And when they tried to tackle this problem, they looked at it from several perspectives. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is the one that most people know of, but actually originally there were also the user agent guidelines, the authoring tool guidelines. So looking at it as the kind of whole ecosystem, because as web designers and developers, we are in control of what we produce. But actually the user's technology is a big factor in this. Things need to work consistently between sites. So they tried to not separate these things, but create aligned guidelines that would work in these different scenarios. And we do tend to focus on the content, but I think one of the reasons the web content guidelines are so important is because of the variety of user agents. So we're probably all familiar with your typical Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Internet Explorer, or Edge these days. And we're all familiar with, historically at least, how different browsers could display things differently. But when you factor in all the different access technologies, switches, screen readers, screen magnifiers that adapt how that web content works, that might be used together or separately, it becomes a monumental kind of testing matrix if you were going to try and approach accessibility from a testing point of view. So really what the advantage of the web content accessibility guidelines is that they try to focus on what in the content, what in your website actually makes things accessible, and then leave the user agents to do their part of that equation. So the creation process, I have to admit, I wasn't around for the first round of this in the late 90s, but originally it would have been things like usability testing, surveys, research, and experts, kind of individual experience, people with disabilities experiences, and putting those all into kind of a big pot and working out what are the sort of common problems across different websites. So all of these different kind of user needs were sort of coming into this funnel. But then there is a filter on what actually gets through to the guidelines. So anything that is considered an issue, in order for that to become a guideline, it needs to have a technique that, a reasonable technique that people can use to resolve that issue. It needs to apply across different technologies. So we do tend to focus on kind of the web stack, but we also used to take into account things like Flash and Silverlight. Those are no longer with us. Probably a good thing in most ways. But we do still consider things like PDFs, EPUB, and other technologies that you can get to essentially via a URL in a browser. And they also need to be things that apply across all websites. So we are trying to consider everything from your personal text-based blog through to almost gaming sites, essentially. And there's a massive range. And if there are particular sites that you can't resolve something on, that's probably not going to become a guideline. I think, as often Patrick Lauker has put it, we don't want to put guidelines in place that you can't meet and get you sued. So this is a sort of important consideration. It has to be applicable across lots of different websites. So in terms of the versions, we had version 1 in 1998, version 2 in 2008, and version 2.1 in 2018, and 2.2 is coming up. So in terms of looking individually at the guidelines, how do we think about those? Where did they come from? And I tend to think of them as working a bit like antibodies. So for example, if you consider poor color contrast as an issue that we're trying to tackle, we try to craft a guideline that tackles that without catching other things. Inappropriate structure might be another problem that we are trying to tackle with a guideline. So again, it's crafting a guideline that will catch those issues, but not other things. So we don't want kind of false positives. We don't want our guidelines catching things that aren't accessibility problems. And just as a kind of a visual example, I've got two screenshots of the same page with the same content. One of these is essentially the Lamezza homepage with all of the colors and graphics stripped out of it, but maintaining the structure. So we've got navigation, banner, main, headings are apparent, and because of the kind of structure, it's visually represented with things like larger text and the layout, and visually you can kind of tell what's what. On the right hand side is the same content, but it's just a plain text, plain stream of text, essentially, all kind of solid, one block, and it really has kind of no structure. And this is just an example where, if you consider headings as one of our structural elements, if it's visually represented as a heading, we want that to be available in the code. Otherwise, you end up with that kind of stream of text experience. And then what is a content guideline? So one of the things you might think if you're approaching this topic is you would want to tackle something like headings and say the guideline should be that users can navigate by headings and lists or other structural elements when appropriate. Unfortunately, that's very difficult to test in the context of just looking at the web content, because you don't know what users can do, what their technology necessarily allows them to do. It would be quite HTML specific. Things like mobile apps and other types of technology may not have that as a built-in thing that you can do. And it means you have to decide what's appropriate, which can be quite difficult if you're not as familiar with all the different assistive technologies and things. So the kind of guideline that works, at least in the WCAG 2 kind of range, is I've put on screen: information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. And I will admit that is more difficult to understand. But it works in terms of if you're looking at the web content and you compare what you're getting visually to what is in the underlying markup, is each element marked up appropriately. That is much easier to test and much more consistent to test. And something you may have come across in the guidelines, and just to get the terminology out of the way, there are 4 principles. I think already people have mentioned today, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. They're categories. And in fact, when people talk about the guidelines, those are also actually just categorizations. So, for example, guideline 3.1, readable, make, I think it's text content readable and understandable. The actual, what people think of as the guidelines, we call success criteria. So language of the page is one of the success criteria. The default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. And that's your testable statement. So when people talk about the guidelines, and I will do this myself, I will say guideline, we actually mean the success criteria, but don't worry about that. It's it's just categorizations. And something else that people like to know about is the levels, what these A, AA, AAA levels mean. And in general, not meeting a particular success criteria at level A will be quite critical. People won't be able to access the content. So things like alt text, if an image is missing alt text, somebody using a screen reader can't read that. Level AA can also be essential for people, and there would be significant barriers. It's potentially there may be workarounds, so it may not be quite as critical as the level A ones. And at the AAA, these actually may also be very important for some people, and very useful, but they could be difficult or infeasible to implement in some circumstances. They may not apply to kind of all types of content, or it might require a change in the look and feel for everyone. So it's not officially defined, but in practice, the more difficult the barrier, the sort of higher the level, the more difficult it is to do. That might bring it down a level or two. So that's the general idea behind those levels. And I have to say, in practice, most sort of government organisations and wherever WCAG is used legally, it's usually the AA level that is referenced. And I will point out, if you head over and look at the guidelines, this is my kind of favorite link whenever I'm looking at the guideline or a particular guideline, is the understanding one. So next to each guideline, there's a link through to an understanding document, and that document should outline what the intent is of the guideline, how to meet it, maybe some examples. And those documents also become our kind of archive, so wherever people have questions and we can answer those questions in the documentation, that is where it will go. So that's the background. What have the sort of more recent updates been since WCAG 2.0? Well, in the sort of late 2000s, we had our whole buttons to touchscreens technology happening, and shortly sort of after that, in the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, several task forces were formed in about 2013. They were focusing on generating the user requirements from a mobile, cognitive and low vision point of view. Those went into the first public working draft in 2017, which became what W3C calls a recommendation, which is basically where it's kind of given a stamp of approval and published. That included 17 new criteria. I'm not going to go through these. If you are interested in those, then go back to the 2019 ID24 and have a look at my presentation from there. So for 2.2, this was something that we decided to go ahead with in late 2018. It was working from a few things left over from 2.1 and a few new ideas that people had in terms of new criteria. We had our first public working draft in February 2020, and then slightly delayed, slightly by pandemic, just also by lots of issues coming in. We are looking to publish towards the end of this year. And when I say it's not published, it is still very much under review. Anything I'm about to go through in terms of its exact details, or even if it's going to be included in 2.2, is not finalized. So these are still under review. So please do not take these as set in stone yet. So we've got quite a few less new criteria than in 2.1. So I think we're on a kind of a downward trend of new things that can go into the 2.x version of WCAG. And there are, so I've got a list on screen, but I'm going to go through each of these individually. So the first, alphabetical order, accessible authentication. So the idea behind this is very much aimed at people with cognitive impairments. Don't make people memorize or transcribe something to log in. So, for example, don't block password managers. That's a very useful tool to not have to remember passwords. You can also use things like WebAuthn, which is where the browser offloads the authentication to your device. So your device might use a PIN, might use a biometric like face recognition or password fingerprint recognition. And essentially then that's up to the user as to how they authenticate. And that's usually a kind of a passwordless method. And you can also use third-party auth type methods. To some extent, that is putting it off to a third party, but those providers, people like Google and Microsoft, do tend to have multiple ways that people can authenticate, so it tends to be a better solution. The exact text is that for each step in an authentication process that relies on a cognitive function test, at least one other authentication method is available that does not rely on a cognitive function test, or a mechanism is available to assist a user in completing the cognitive function test. So obviously that cognitive function test is a key part, and that's any task that requires the user to remember, manipulate, or transcribe information. So that's going to catch things like captures, where you have to transcribe from a fuzzy set of characters to type that in. It will also catch the second factor devices where you have those time-based codes where you have to type in 6 letters from your phone. So there needs to be another method. It's not that you can't use those, but there needs to be another method for the user to authenticate with. I've got on screen as an example one of the USB devices where that basically types in those time-based codes for you. You just press the button on the USB, it does it for you. Or you can use a third party to do that. So there is also at the AA level an exception, and this is new, hot off the press this week. So when the cognitive function test is used to recognize common objects or content the user has provided to the website, that is considered out of scope. So for example, this came about because in certain quite niche circumstances, sites will need to protect their authentication kind of process from robots and other forms of kind of systematic scripted abuse. So they will put in things like those annoying captures where you have to tick all the taxis and things. At the moment, there really isn't a useful alternative that an organization like that can put in place. So we do have this exception for those. And there is now a AAA version that does not have that exception. So what we're trying to say with this is essentially, look, we really don't want to have this exception, but we know it is needed for the moment. So we've got a AAA version that's identical, but lacks that exception. So it is quite a niche case, but it is a case we have had to deal with because otherwise we would not get this guideline in. Next one is dragging movements. Relatively straightforward to explain, actually. Don't rely on dragging. Include buttons or an alternative method. So, for example, you've got very typical drag and drop listings. I've got a couple of screenshots on. There are options such as having little arrows next to each one that you can use to sort of move it up and down. You can have little drop downs that adjust the order. Little example from Trello where you can set its position kind of manually without having to drag and drop. But they are also, it's not that drag and drop is a bad thing to do. It's just there needs to be alternative for people. And it's not people who are using keyboard access, that's already covered. But it's for people who are using a touch screen, but maybe not particularly dexterous. Consistent help. Again, a relatively straightforward one to explain. So if you provide a help mechanism, provide it in a consistent location across pages. I've got a screenshot from a shopping website that in the top right-hand side has a help link. Now, that's the easy way of explaining it. This is one of those ones that's actually been very difficult to construct the exact text that people can test with. So the current text is for each web page within a set of web pages that provides one or more of the following ways of finding help. Access to at least one form of help is included in the same relative order on each page. And then the listing of those is human contact details, human contact mechanism, self-help option, or a fully automated contact mechanism. So that's things like chatbots. So obviously, the ideal would be that there is a human contact mechanism that anyone can access on any page from the same location. But there are lots of cases where that isn't possible. A personal blog is not going to have, a phone number that's always going to be available. So, and at the other end of the scale, you might have an organization that has a huge number of ways that you can get in touch that you couldn't fit into one part of every page. So the idea is that either, a phone number or a human contact mechanism or a link to a page with all of those things on is consistently available. So hopefully that is a sort of more realistic ask of most organizations. And possibly the most complicated one is focus appearance. So just to introduce this, we've had focus visible since WCAG 2.0, but that has not defined how visible a focus indicator should be. We've also got non-text contrast in WCAG 2.1, which does provide a kind of minimum adjacent contrast level for a focus indicator. However, there's lots of instances where that really isn't sufficient. And from some of the investigations we've done, there are three main factors that affect the visibility of the indicator. The first is a change of color or change of contrast, really, from the non-focus state to the focus state. So I've got three animations going on. Apologies, they are quite sort of small and actually not very visible because these are the poor examples. So the first animation is four dark buttons with a light grey outline that is on top of a white background. So that change of contrast between light grey and white is not good. That's quite difficult to see. For anyone who can't see these animations, my apologies, these are the bad examples. The second main factor is the size and thickness of the change. So the second example is four, don't know why I keep saying three, four light grey buttons, and on the left-hand side of each one is the kind of focus indicator, which is a thin dark line. So it's got good contrast, but it's very small. And the final factor is the adjacency aspect. So we've got four dark buttons, and a thin dark outline is the focus indicator. So as each button sort of goes into focus, it very slightly increases in size. But again, it's not very visible. And I'm then going to start with the AAA version of this, which is basically ensure the focus indicator is at least equivalent to a contrasting 2-pixel outline. Now, it doesn't have to be an outline. The idea is that whatever area that outline would create, you could make that into a different shape, or you could do something like change the background color. So the two examples I've got are hopefully much more clear this time. The first one is for light grey buttons with a dark, thick outline going back and forth. And the bottom example is, again, for grey buttons, and the focus indicator is where the whole background changes from light grey to black, which is, again, very visible. So the exact text of Focus Appearance Enhanced, which is the AAA one, is that when user interface components have keyboard focus, all the following are true. And we've got first bullet is contrasting area. So there is an area of the focus indicator that has a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 between the colors in the focused and the unfocused states. And the reason it says there is an area of the focus indicator is we don't want to ban things like a nice strong focus indicator that also has like a drop shadow on it, or a gradient, or something that actually makes it even bigger, but parts of it wouldn't meet 4.5 to 1. The second bullet is minimum area. So the contrasting area is at least double the area of a 1 CSS pixel thick perimeter of the unfocused component. So if you had a square button of 100 pixels on each side, we would be looking for just under an 800 pixel area of that focus indicator. And then the last button is not obscured, so no part of the focused indicator is hidden by author-created content. So basically, if you're focusing on something, that shouldn't be hidden behind a sticky footer or a panel that kind of comes over it. So that's the AAA version. So the AA version needs to be a little bit more flexible. So again, we're looking for a change in sort of contrast so that it has a contrast ratio of at least 3.1 compared to the unfocused pixels. And I've got an example at the top with 2 blue buttons, and the right-hand one has a kind of blue indicator, so in the unfocused state, those pixels are white. In the focused state, those pixels are dark blue. And then from a size point of view, we've got two measures here. The first is that it's at least the size of a 1 CSS pixel thick perimeter. And the same example works for that as well. And then there's another size metric. So this is an alternative. We can use either one. And the second one is it's at least as large as a 4 CSS pixel thick line along the shortest side of a minimum bounding box and no thinner than 2 CSS pixels. Let's break that down a bit. So if you look at a box, and we've got several rectangles on screen, if you take the shortest side and you had something that was at least the size of a 4 CSS pixel thick line along that shortest side, that's our minimum. It talks about the bounding box because what we found is we've got things like circles, we've got star shapes, we've got various other things that are not necessarily rectangles, which we need to be able to apply this to. So a bounding box is just a box, the smallest box you can draw around that shape. So you then take that as your measure. And the reason we have no thinner than 2 CSS pixels is that for these shorter or smaller indicators, thickness is really important. So it is an area calculation. People could have then used that area calculation to use a smaller focus indicator. But if we apply, if we have this requirement that it is no thinner than 2 CSS pixels, then at least it has a reasonable thickness. And then lastly, has a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against the adjacent colors in the focused component, or a thickness of at least 2 CSS pixels. So this one is just trying to eliminate that possibility where people put a thin, dark border around a dark button that barely adjusts the size. If that's at least 2 CSS pixels thick, that means the box is getting 4 pixels taller and 4 pixels wider, and that's just about enough in terms of a visible change. So this is one of the more complex ones. Actually codifying the visibility of a focus indicator turned out to be quite a difficult thing to do. But I would just suggest the simplest way of doing it is a 1 pixel outline that's separated from any kind of boundary, or a 2 CSS pixel outline. These are your easy ways of doing it. Go forth and do those. And then the final part of the AA one is that it's not fully obscured by author-created content. And I've just got a little video where it tabs through this kind of zoomed in page with a very kind of thick, sticky footer and a sticky header. And as you're going up and down the page, the focus gets hidden behind them. So as you go down the page, it gets hidden behind the footer. And then if you shift tab back up the page, it gets hidden behind the header. Now, there are ways around this. Scroll padding is a relatively new CSS thing where you can say, keep the focus within a certain area. And that solves this problem. But at the AA level, there needs to be some flexibility. So the item with focus shouldn't entirely be hidden by author-created content. So I've put the kind of full focus appearance minimum text on screen. I won't read all of this because I've just been through everything, but I have tweeted out a link to the latest version, just hopefully about now, if it schedules correctly. So our next one is page break navigation. So basically, if you publish a book online with page numbering, add a navigation mechanism to get to the pages. And the success criteria text is, for web content with page break locators, a mechanism is available to navigate to each locator. Now, this is quite niche. For most people, you're not going to come across this requirement. It primarily comes from the EPUB side of W3C, where if you're using an EPUB, this is actually built in. So if an EPUB has the kind of markers for page numbers within it, the Kindle or whatever user agent you're using will generally have a mechanism to get to those page numbers. However, people, particularly in education, have been publishing the same content to be accessible by your regular browsers, and the browsers don't have that functionality built in. So if, as in the screenshot, you're publishing something like, the Kindle Cloud version, where in your browser you can go and read your books, that is where you need to build the functionality to get to each of these page numbers. And it's really helpful for people in education, particularly if you're using a screen reader, or even if you kind of zoom in, the page numbering will be sort of quite different. So being able to, for the teacher to say, everyone go to page 50, we need to be able to navigate to those page numbers, basically. And one coming from the cognitive side is it can be incredibly difficult if certain controls only appear when you hover over something. I've got a little demonstration on screen, Squarespace, where basically until you hover over something, you don't know what kind of options or navigation there are. So the idea is that if you do use things appear on hover, make sure there is some indicator of that functionality. So on Squarespace, there is nothing until you hover over it. So things like a little edit icon, a little pencil icon, or something to indicate that actually hovering over this thing provides extra functionality. So and again, this is a kind of simple in concept, but slightly trickier when it comes to actually pinning it down to be testable. So where receiving a pointer hover or keyboard focus triggers user interface components to be visible, information needed to identify that user interface component are available. To identify that user interface components are available is visible, and then we've got several exceptions. So one is that if there is an equivalent mechanism for doing the same function, then you don't have to have a visible indicator for the other versions of it. If it's specifically for keyboard navigation, like a skip link, you don't need to make that visible as well. If there's a mechanism to make these identifiers persistently visible, that's okay as well. Or if it's essential that it's hidden, so you might have some kind of game or test where actually focusing or hovering on things provides the answers. So there might be some reasons where that is essential. And target size is another one. We started off aiming for the kind of 44 pixel size as a minimum target size. But unfortunately, we just came across too many instances where it's actually quite necessary to have smaller targets. We even had a complaint from somebody with low vision saying, you can't make all the buttons in my document editing interface bigger because I'm zoomed in so much, I just won't have any content as part of that navigation bar. So they were quite determined that we didn't have these larger sizes. And in fact, if you look at things like the Apple, Android, or Microsoft guidelines, they will say that they should have 44 or 48 pixels or DPs or whatever unit they're using, and then not follow that themselves. So whilst they are guidelines, from a WCAG point of view, we're in the position of, well, if we specified 44, people get sued, and that's actually not a good thing in this circumstance. So the effect was reducing that down to 24 pixels seemed like a reasonable minimum baseline. And please do consider this the baseline. Where also it's not that every target has to be 24 by 24 pixels. It could be smaller if it has spacing around it. So we have this concept of target offset, which is the distance measured from the farthest point of a target to the nearest point of a second target. So basically, if you've got an 18 pixel target, you would then need 6 pixels space to the next target. So things can be smaller if they have spacing. So the actual success criteria text basically states that have an area of 24 by 24 pixels unless you have spacing, unless it's in line in a sentence or a block of text, unless it's necessary or essential or legally required for the information being conveyed. I think I've got some duplication going on in the visible text. I'll check that. And yeah, we do have some issues with kind of legal documents that have to have certain size objects on them. Redundant entry is, again, a cognitive-based one where we're aiming for people not to be asked the same information twice in the same process. So if you do ask people for the same information like an address or an ID number, either auto-populate it or make it available for the user to select, like a sort of copy-paste mechanism. And that's fairly straightforward in terms of the success criteria text. Information previously entered by or provided to the user that is required to be entered again in the same process and in the same user session is either auto-populated or available for the user to select, except when re-entering the information is essential, the information is required to ensure the security of the content, or previously entered information is no longer valid. So that security one is things like if you're creating a new password, it probably is a good idea to ask people to put that in twice. So those are the new guidelines that probably will be in WCAG 2.2. Don't take it for certain yet, but that's the current status. What should you do with these guidelines in general, not just the new ones, but all of them? So in general, I would advise to consider these a baseline for avoiding accessibility issues. I would work out, particularly if you're in an organization, you're in a team, work out when and who should apply each. And customize them, make them your guidelines. Don't just refer to these fairly abstracted guidelines. Come up with how your interpretation that meets and exceeds the guidelines, because that's actually easier when you're doing it for yourself. Define how you do things, like here is our heading approach. I'll come onto that in a second. Test little and often, and feed the results back into your artifacts like brand guidelines, components, and process as well. So if you miss things, how can we catch it next time? And the reason I sort of talk about baseline is I've got a Venn diagram with big circle for usability, a subcircle of accessibility within that, a subcircle with reliably testable accessibility, and then an even smaller circle for automatically testable accessibility. And the guidelines really come in at that reliably testable circle. But there is a lot of accessibility that doesn't fit in there. And I also want to point out the COGA usable document, making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities, is a very good sort of set of guidance that really helps to cover that outer layer of accessibility. It's not necessarily reliably testable, but it's still important. Also, look at the currently 50, soon to be maybe 60 AA guidelines, and just break it down by your process. So from a design point of view, how many of these are applicable? How do we apply them? From a front-end code point of view, from a tester point of view, sorry, testers, you kind of have to do everything. But yeah, you can break it down and you can give people really specific advice. And this is important in a medical context. When people came up with surgical test checklists, although they were 95% the same between different teams, that 5% difference, that 5% change that people made to customize it to them made all the difference in uptake. And then define how you do things. So there are many pages on things like headings in the WCAG documentation. It's actually much easier to decide in your context, with your template, how do you implement headings? And then convert that into your component library, or I'm showing on screen an example from the NHS Service Manual, where it just states, here's how we do things, here's how we work on accessibility and do things like page structure. And you can make it so much simpler when you're saying, here's how we do it, instead of using a guideline that has to apply across every variety of websites. And try and set up that kind of virtuous circle of feeding any information you find from each project into your kind of core code libraries, design patterns, and brand guidelines. So as you go through any particular project, feed that back in. If you find an issue with a particular component, fix it for next time. And then lastly, because people do tend to use the guidelines for testing, I just wanted to give a very brief go at the sort of different testing methods people use. So originally the guidelines came from testing with people and people's experiences, and they were sort of boiled down into a set of guidelines. And those guidelines are what are used by the automated testing tools and the review tools. So usability testing with people with disabilities is great for things which are live. It's great for prioritization, learning, and getting buy-in from stakeholders. But it does tend to sort of be quite cost prohibitive for smaller projects. And it doesn't necessarily get you great coverage across a whole website. Testing with the guidelines is great for kind of later stages of development. It's great for coverage of a website or an application if you get a good sample. And it's kind of good and necessary for saying you've done your bit. It's not so good for inexperienced testers. It does take a bit of experience not to generate false positives and to work out what things are passing and failing. Automated testing is generally based on the guidelines, or at least a subset of them, and it's great for wide coverage or integrating with the build process. But you can't use it to say you've met the guidelines. The guidelines are intentionally set up in a way to say you can tell when you've failed, but you can't tell from an automatic point of view when you've passed. That does need human oversight. So to summarize that, I've got a graphic on screen with usability testing with people with disabilities across the top, which is a wide, narrow bar. Got usability testing on the right, which is a slightly thicker but narrow bar. A manual audit, which is quite wide and even thicker. And then automated testing is not wide, but very thick. And this is on basically comparing coverage to the range of issues you can find. So automated testing is great for coverage of a site, but not for the range of issues that you can find. And then usability testing with people with disabilities is great for the range of issues you can find, but not so good for coverage. And a manual audit does tend to fit into that kind of middle sweet spot. If you get a good sample, you can get to a lot of the agreed accessibility issues, much more than automated testing. But and it tends to be a quicker way of performing this kind of testing. So thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully that has been useful for people. And do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Alistair. I can't think of anyone better to walk us through the possible new success criterion. So yeah, Kevin, do we have any questions? I think we've got time for probably one, maybe two. We'll see how we go.
Just first of all, thank you, Alistair, so much. That's absolutely fascinating. I do a lot of this day to day, and I've learned loads from you, so it's really, really interesting, really helpful. So we've got a couple of questions through. The first one is, will the ISO IEC 40500 be updated when WCAG 2.2 becomes a W3C recommendation?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that one. It's a completely separate organization, I believe. In fact, I'm not going to speculate. I will ask around and tweet about that later if I can find out, but I'm afraid that is quite a separate organization to us, and I don't know.
Excellent, thank you so much. The second one that's come through, which hopefully you will be able to answer, is are there any plans for the WCAG EM tool to support 2.2?
That's going to depend on the way resources. So again, I can ask, but I wouldn't expect that to happen in the immediate future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more, Henny? We're slightly over, I think.
I think if we're slightly over, we might have to wrap it up actually, just so everybody else can get on for the next one. But thank you so much, Alistair. That was really good. And thank you, Kevin, as well. If you liked this session, please do hit the YouTube like button. And don't forget, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/inclusive design 24 with 24 as numbers, to be kept in the loop of future events and indeed to catch up on any of the talks today or in previous years you might not have seen. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. And finally, Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with much thanks to our supporters, who are Intopia, Fable, TPG Arc, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, Infoaxia, the Centre for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA, Adrian Roselli, LLC, and Can Access. We'll be back at the top of the hour, so in approximately 8 minutes. So hopefully we'll be welcoming you all back then. Bye for now.